That was War Pigs by Black Sabbath. Welcome back to another edition of the Awake and Aware radio show. This is your host, Infinite Consciousness, commonly known as Jason. Please visit Awake and Aware and Part of the Solution on Facebook and check out Freedom from Compulsions at www.freedomfromcompulsions.vpweb.com. If you would like to access all the past shows, go to www.blogtalkradio.com/infiniteconsciousness. Last week we discussed the state stealing of children and how there is an eventual agenda to have all children CPS and raised in government-ran dormitory-type settings, as well as how some of these children end up in government-sponsored pedophile rings. This week we will discuss the truth about the military. Quote, military men are dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns for foreign policy. End quote. Henry Kissinger, our very own. The corporate U.S. military is currently being used to push Israeli Rothschild Zionist wars in numerous nations that has nothing to do with either safety or security for the United States, but actually is helping to destroy the U.S. and many parts of the globe. As stated in some of my earlier shows, the Rothschilds created Israel in 1948 after funding both sides of World War II and pushing their partial bloodline of Hitler into power so they could push their creation of Zionism in the creation of a greater Israel. Now, the U.S. government is flooded with Zionist placement, and various members of the Rothschild-created think tanks of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, and Roundtable Group, all while AIPAC influences foreign policy of the United States. Israel actually dictates U.S. foreign policy through all of these resources. Also, as a reminder, the Rothschild bloodline, when under various different names, created the money system in Babylon used to enslave both people and nations with debt, while profiting off of war when they fund both sides, in turn consolidating power. Currently, the Rothschilds have enslaved most nations with their private central banks, the Federal Reserve in the U.S. case and Bank of England was England, and have created every economic crisis for more consolidation of power. The Rothschild Zionists also own all of the major media outlets that implant conditioned belief systems into the sleeping masses who watch the resident hypnotist, the television, and believe what it tells them without question. Implanted beliefs through these propaganda devices always paint the picture that will go towards the Zionist agenda. But also keep in mind that all of the major media outlets are also involved in defense contracts, meaning they will not paint a negative image of war. Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, trumpeted the war, quote, the war in Iraq was conceived by neoconservative intellectuals, most of them Jewish. This is no longer an academic exercise, one of them says. We are responsible for what is happening, end quote. The neoconservative intellectuals are agents of the Illuminati Rothschild banking cartel. Its goal is to integrate the Middle East into the New World Order at the expense of the U.S. soldier and taxpayer. This is the true nature of imperialism. The Rothschild agents pulling Bush's strings included Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feist, William Kristol, Elliot Abrams, and Charles Krauthammer. Richard Pearl and Douglas Feist were members of a Likud Party think tank that recommended in 1996, quote, Israel shape its strategic environment beginning with the removal of Saddam Hussein, end quote. The 9/11 attack was designed to mentally prepare Americans to be shapers of Israel's strategic environment in the Middle East. See also the Zionist roots of the war on terror. Propaganda, the art of a half-truth. Elite Zionists, whether neocon, liberal, or leftist, control American perception as well as policy. You simply cannot be heard in the mainstream media unless you toe the Zionist line. Fahrenheit 9/11 wants you to believe the Saudis and the Bushes colluded to profit from war and oil. It shows that the Bushes and bin Ladens had a long-term business relationship and Saudis fund terrorism. Michael Moore, fails to mention that Rothschild agent financier George Soros also bailed out George W. And we must also keep in mind that the House of Saud is really the House of Rothschild. Fahrenheit 9/11 pretends Osama bin Laden was responsible for the attack on the World Trade Center. Moore doesn't mention evidence linking the attack to the Mossad, the elements of the CIA and FBI, which all work for the Illuminati bankers. Keep in mind, too, ladies and gentlemen, that Mossad is really Rothschild intelligence and not necessarily Israeli. He doesn't mention evidence Saudi terrorists are still alive. No passenger jet hit the Pentagon, and the World Trade Center collapse was a controlled demolition. To be effective, propaganda must contain an element of truth. War and oil profit was the payoff for Bush and his gang. In return, they will take the fall for the war's unpopularity. 9/11 and Iraq are about bigger stakes, the step-by-step enslavement of mankind. The bankster agenda. The Illuminist bankers are organizing a global fascist state that they can directly control. Of course, this is being done in the name of freedom and human rights. The revealing Haaretz article is based on interviews with 3 neocon Jewish hacks, William Kristol, Charles Krauthammer, and Thomas Friedman. The latter 2 write for the bankster-owned Washington Post and New York Times. The article speaks of rebuilding the world in the image of the United States. That's a quote. Their focus now is on the Middle East. Krauthammer, this is what he said, quote, the war on Iraq is being fought to replace the demonic deal cut with the Arab world decades ago. That deal said, you will send us oil and we will not intervene with your internal affairs, end quote. Translation, Rothschild Rockefeller are tired of giving Arabs such a large cut of the pie. They want direct control of Middle East oil. Krauthammer, this is what he said, quote, if the victory is contaminated and slow, it will be impossible to go on the other Arab states after Iraq, end quote. Translation, they want to undermine the independence of Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iran, and possibly even Egypt. When they're finished with the rest of the world, they will turn their attention to America. Kristol, quote, and the way to fight chaos is to fight to create a new world order. So that really is what this war is about. It is being fought to consolidate a new world order to create a new Middle East, end quote. Translation, freeways, malls, Prozac, pornography, and Taco Bells, cultural genocide. William Kristol is the chairman of the Project for a New American Century. Elites use war to oppress the masses and retain power. It is eerie to see impoverished youth enlisted to oppress other people. The bankers hate free enterprise and competition. They want to control supply through monopoly capitalism and demand through big government. They want a total monopoly on power and wealth and use war to achieve it. America's change from a civilian to a military economy reached a point of no return in the 1960s. From then on, a perpetual war machine was in motion with Wall Street Zionist investment banks funding U.S. armament industries. The change can be traced to Truman's National Security Council paper, NSC 68, which put forth that America could sustain its economic growth by applying John Maynard Keynes' emphasis on the role of government to the military or security sphere. Truman signed the paper as a basic U.S. policy doctrine on September 30th, 1950. Although the world was at peace, the directive called for increasing the annual U.S. arms budget by 350%. Military Keynesianism, I know I mutilated that word, so I apologize for that, soon became the essence of America's economy, and the Zionists of Wall Street took full advantage of this new investment opportunity. While military contracts were awarded to defense contractors to maintain the Cold War with Russia, U.S. industrial plants began to decay. Outsourcing came into vogue as Americans bought TV sets, cameras, and cars from overseas. American labels on foreign goods were just American wrappers on Asian products. Turning their investments to consumer production and commercial markets abroad, Wall Street Zionists began concentrating their finances on military production at home. Skilled technique and able management now belonged to Japan, not America. Zionist bankers were no longer interested in domestic civilian production. Their market was the U.S. government, and payments were fed by the Rothschild-owned Federal Reserve. So why bother investing in American-made cameras or washing machines when you could invest in bombers and drones? The profits were much larger and the risks were zero. Reaching a position of permanence after 9/11, military Keynesianism had produced a national security state controlled by Zionists and financed by Wall Street Zionists. By signing NSC 68 in 1950, Harry Truman had given birth to a military Zionist global beast. Zionists fund the U.S. war machine. The push for new and more deadly weapons is currently fueled by Zionist investment banks with Goldman Sachs and State Street Corporation at the lead, with military spending being the largest single item in the federal budget for fiscal 2010, and calls from Obama to a record $708 billion to fund his wars. Defense contractors get their marching orders from Zionist investment analysts who dictate contractors' businesses' policies from their financial towers on Wall Street. Based on a Goldman Sachs published on June 5, 2009, which forecasted a decline in investments in defense industries, General Dynamics announced that it was acquiring ASICS Technologies, a company that provides high-end optics for unmanned drones, in order to attract investors. In another example of Zionist bankers' control of defense contractors, shares of Lockheed Martin were driven down by 1.3% on January 6, 2010, after Goldman Sachs told investors to sell rather than hold Lockheed stocks. Not only do the Zionists on Wall Street control military industries externally, but they maintain leverage over the defense contractors internally. A greater amount of power over the military industries has been concentrated into fewer hands. It only takes 10% ownership of stock to control a widely held corporation, and these hands are those of huge Zionist investment blocks. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman have large Zionist banks on their major investors. The huge investment bank State Street Corporation is the major stockholder of these three top U.S. defense contractors. In the board of directors of SSC, one can find the names of Robert S. Kaplan, former senior director of Goldman Sachs, Robert Weissman, and Peter Coyne, former chairman of Lehman Brothers. State Street Bank owns 18.99% of Lockheed Martin stock, 11.09% of Boeing stock, and 9.48% of Northrop Grumman stock. Co-shareholders in these companies, as well as in the Halliburton and Raytheon, include the Zionist investment banks Goldman Sachs, Oppenheimer Funds, and Capital Research and Management Company. In other words, no general of America's armed forces, and thus the entire U.S. military, makes a decision apart from the Zionists on Wall Street who control his ability to wage war with the deadly armaments they provide. Israel launched a diplomatic initiative in an effort to influence the outcome of NATO's new strategic concept, reported the Jerusalem Post on January 13, 2010. Participating in NATO's strategic concept seminar this January, Israel, other members of NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue, joined former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who chairs the group of experts on NATO's new strategic concept in expanding bloodshed and war crimes throughout the world. Albright, of Czech Jewish origin, who ordered NATO's bombing of Serbian civilians in 1999, said at the opening session, quote, "Partnerships are central to NATO's future. The passing years have created the need for a NATO of greater reach. We have learned that partnerships can act as a force multiplier." Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, also that NATO is the predecessor to the global military machine that they're beginning to build. There was a meeting a couple years ago between NATO and UN peacekeeping forces for NATO to take over U.S. peacekeeping forces to create a global military sometime in the future. But back to the topic here. In a series of joint military drills since 2004, Israel has been part of U.S.-led NATO's quest to become a global military and police force with membership advocates in key positions in America. General James Jones, Obama's national security advisor, is a major promoter of Israel's inclusion in the alliance. In the September-October issue of Foreign Affairs, published by the Council on Foreign Relations, Zionist James Goldgear wrote an article called Global NATO, which called for Israel's membership in NATO. Quote, "With little fanfare and even less notice, NATO has gone global. The principle enshrined in Article 5 that an attack on one is an attack on all must remain at the core of the alliance. Potential new members, like Israel, may not pose much of an issue in this respect. For after all, the U.S. already guarantees Israel's security," end quote. On January 23, 2010, a delegation of Israeli cabinet ministers headed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a joint cabinet meeting with their counterparts in Berlin. The subject under discussion was Israel's intention to station German-made and subsidized Dolphin submarines in the Persian Gulf bordering Iran. During the Berlin talks, Israel's Devka Baal reported that the recent deployment of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf added muscle, quote-unquote, to the words of General David Petraeus, who said that Iran's nuclear infrastructure, quote, can be bombed, end quote. Iranian officials have subsequently questioned the West's 90 war vessels in the Gulf, calling it a, quote, military environment, end quote, arrayed against Iran. America's Addiction, Waging Illegal Wars, by Stephen Linman. I pulled this out because it's very interesting. With regard to war, international and constitutional law are clear. Under the Constitution's Article 1, Section 8, only Congress may declare war and not the President. That, in fact, last happened on December 8, 1941, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. As a result, all subsequent U.S. wars have been illegal, including Obama's against Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Libya, and up to date, many, many more. Moreover, the UN Charter explains under what conditions violence and coercion by one state against another are justified. Article 2.3 and Article 33.1 require peaceful settlement of international disputes. Article 2.4 prohibits force of its threatened use, and Article 51 allows, quote, the right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member, until the Security Council has taken measures to maintain international peace and security, end quote. In other words, justifiable self-defense is permissible. However, Charter Articles 2.3 and 2.4 and 33 absolutely prohibit any unilateral threat of use of force, not specifically allowed under Article 51, authorized by the Security Council, or permitted by the U.S. Constitution. Only amendments ratified by 3/4 of the states can change. In addition, 3 General Assembly resolutions also prohibit non-consensual belligerent intervention, including the 1965 Declaration on the Inadmissibility of Intervention in the Domestic Affairs of States and the Protection of their Independence and Sovereignty, the 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation among States in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, and the 1974 definition of aggression. Nonetheless, Washington spurns international and U.S. laws repeatedly, especially waging preemptive aggressive wars, what the Nuremberg Tribunal's Justice Robert Jackson called, quote, the supreme international crime against peace, end quote, sentencing convicted Nazi war criminals to death for committing it. The War Powers Resolution, WPR, this resolution holds for legal wars. Applying it to Libya, however, is a red herring, as America has no authority to attack another country illegally and may only do so in self-defense until the Security Council acts. Despite questions about its constitutionality, on November 7, 1973, the WPR was passed over Nixon's veto, authorizing Congress and presidents jointly to decide whether to send U.S. forces into conflict zones. As a result, Section 4A1 requires presidents to inform Congress within 48 hours about any introduced to areas with ongoing or imminent hostilities. In it, he must explain why U.S. forces are being sent, the constitutional or legislative authority permitting him to do so, the estimated extent and duration of the involvement, and whatever other information Congress requests. Section 5B then mandates withdrawal within 60 days plus an additional 30 exit period unless Congress extends the time frame for another 30 days. Declares war or unavoidable circumstances require more time, not an unlimited amount. An exception applies. As Commander-in-Chief, presidents may introduce U.S. forces unilaterally into conflict areas in case of national emergency if America, its territories, possessions, or military is attacked. Nonetheless, every possible effort must be made to keep Congress informed no matter the circumstances. Since passed, however, presidents ignored WPR as well as constitutional and international law, including Obama's illegal wars with no congressional objections except some boilerplate political posturing. Congressional power to end ongoing wars. Congress, in fact, has power presidents lack, the power of the purse to authorize, refuse, or end funding at its discretion. So what's going on now then, ladies and gentlemen? You know, we're not getting Congress's approval. They're going right over Congress's head. All right, the Constitution's Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 says, quote, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills, end quote. Either House may originate an appropriations bill, although the House claims sole authority. Either one may also amend bills, including revenue and appropriations ones. Although Congress rarely rescinds authorized funds, it can easily withhold future amounts without which wars end and troops are withdrawn. Congressional appropriation power is the key. In the House Appropriations Committee and Senate Committee on Appropriations, both authorized under the Constitution's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, saying, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time, end quote. In fact, only Congress has appropriations authority requiring passage in both houses, including amounts of war, national defense, and other discretionary and mandatory categories. As a result, ending wars and occupations is as simple as defunding them. Capitol Hill politics aside, it only happened once post-World War II. So ignore the political rhetoric belying America's imperial agenda both parties endorse, eager to wage new wars when old ones end by creating enemies when none exist. How Congress ended the Vietnam War. An early critic, Senator Frank Church, said sending troops there would be a, quote, hopeless entanglement, the end of which is difficult to see, end quote. Before I go on, ladies and gentlemen, keep in mind also that They finally admitted that the Gulf of Tonkin incident that led us into the Vietnam War never even happened. All right. Others in Congress agreed but spoke privately, including William Fulbright, Albert Gore Sr., the former vice president's father, Stuart Smingan, and Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. Even Lyndon Johnson was conflicted and taped May 1964 Oval Office conversations with his best Senate friend, Richard Russell, telling him he faced a Hobson's choice, saying, quote, "I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't," end quote. The former being impeachment for pulling out, the latter certain defeat that destroyed him. Asking advice about the Vietnam thing, Russell called it the damn worst mess I ever saw, warning we weren't ready to send troops to fight a jungle war, and adding if the option was introducing Americans or get out, quote, "I'd get out," end quote, because the territory wasn't a damn bit important. 3 months later, the Gulf of Tonkin, which was admitted never happened, embroiled America for over a decade despite Johnson's misgivings. As a result, it ruined his presidency, shortened his life after 3 heart attacks, ending in a disgrace, defeating a once-bigger-than-life majority leader and president. In 1965, in fact, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara told Johnson, quote, "I don't believe they're ever going to quit, and I don't see that we have any plan for victory, militarily or diplomatically," end quote, spoken as he began escalating dramatically, knowing the futility and lawlessness. As early as 1966, congressional opposition emerged. As a result, Congress reasserted appropriations power incrementally, rhetorically at first. However, by June 30th, 1970, the Church-Cooper Amendment, attached to a supplemental aid bill, stipulated no further spending for soldiers, combat assistance, advisors, or bombing operations in Cambodia. It was the first attempted congressional war-making constraint. Nixon ignored it, but other measures followed, including the key Church-Clifford case in 1972 Senate Amendment attached to foreign aid legislation to end all Southeast Asia military funding except for withdrawal subject to releasing POWs. It was the first time either house passed legislation to defund wars. Though defeated in the House, it showed anti-war forces strengthening that in time would prevail. In June 1973, they did when Congress passed the Church Case Amendment, ending all funding after August 15th. In November, Congress then passed the War Powers Resolution, overriding Nixon's veto, limiting presidential power as explained above. But April 30th, 1975, America ended its involvement entirely with a humiliating Saigon embassy rooftop pullout. It could happen now, but doesn't because of America's war addiction, feeding its insatiable military-industrial complex appetite far larger and more powerful than decades earlier. As a result, Congress and presidents go along, acceding to its authority over their own pious rhetoric aside about pursuing peace, humanitarian concerns, and democratic values, causing millions of deaths, vast destruction, and immeasurable human misery in the last 2 decades alone. Obama today wages illegal wars against 4 countries, and now it's more, and numerous proxy ones for the unchallengeable U.S. dominance, at the same time spurning growing popular needs during a deepening Main Street depression. Spending around $1.5 trillion annually for militarism, as well as trillions more for Wall Street and other corporate favorites, he's heading America closer to tyranny and ruin. So far, however, public opposition is lacking despite the urgency to act or face consequences too dire to imagine. Again, as a reminder, it's not necessarily Obama. He's just a puppet for the Rothschild banking cartel. A May 25th ACLU alert highlighted Section 1034 in H.R. 1540, National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2012, titled Affirmation of Armed Conflict with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Associated Forces. It authorizes military force anywhere against suspected terrorists, including domestically. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that Al-Qaeda is a CIA database creation, while the CIA got caught funding the Taliban numerous times. As a result, the ACLU warned, quote, Congress may soon vote on a new declaration of worldwide war without end and without clear enemies, end quote. If enacted by both houses and signed by Obama, it'll be the single biggest handover of unchecked war authority from Congress to the executive branch in modern American history, end quote. On May 26, H.R. 1540 passed, 322 to 96. On May 12th, a companion Senate bill, S-981, was introduced and referred to committee for consideration. So far, no further action was taken, nor it is clear whether Section 1034's language will be included unchanged or at all. The situation bears watching at a time America heads closer to tyranny and out-of-control militarism, menacing peace and democratic values everywhere. Isn't that incentive enough for mass outrage to stop it? Also, keep in mind that Barack Obama, shall we say Barry Soetoro, has ties with the CIA and is a member of the Rothschild-created CFR, just as McCain and Clinton are. Remember, the illusion of presidents are selected for us, not elected by us. I am now going to switch gears to symbolism. Our soldiers are literally being sacrificed to the gods, or shall we say reptilian gods in the higher dimensions. Some of the symbols on their uniforms are actually ancient esoteric symbols during sacrifices to the gods. They are on the uniforms of soldiers who are fooled into believing they are saving their nation so that if they die on the battlefield in horror, they are being sacrificed to their gods while at the same time generating the vibrational frequencies of fear which they feed off of. In regards to symbolism, I would like you all to go to VigilantCitizen.com and look up an article called The Top 10 Most Sinister PsyOps Mission Patches. I'm going to go through some of these. They are very interesting. A lot of reptile and lizard and snake and dragon symbols here. All right, so if you guys can go that if you want to. If not, that's okay. I'm just going to go through some of this. Also, I'm going off live in about 60 seconds. So if you want to see or listen to the rest of the show, it's going to go off air, but it will continue for another 15 minutes. So please go to the website at blogtalkradio.com/infiniteconsciousness to link to this actual show. Let me continue on here. Mission patches. This is straight from the article from Vigilant Citizen. Mission patches are used by military and space organizations to identify, symbolize, and describe a mission's objectives and its crew. This tradition is also observed in the shady world of PsyOps, where each secret mission Pentagon gets a patch. These patches offer a rare glimpse into the Pentagon's secret operations, and the symbolism on them is rather striking, ominous, and cryptic phrases, dark occult symbolism, references to secret societies, and sometimes even a rather dark sense of humor. Here's the top 10 most sinister PsyOps patches. All right. In 1965, NASA began using cloth patches to identify each of its missions and to symbolize the mission's objectives and their crew. Each rocket launch was therefore a patch designed by crew members and in collaboration with the official design team. The patches are then proudly displayed on equipment and worn by NASA astronauts and other personnel affiliated with a particular manned or unmanned space mission. All right, let's look at some various NASA mission patches that they have right in this article. Since then, other organizations involved in space travel and secret operations began using mission patches, including those that specialize in PSYOPs, psychological warfare, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and National Reconnaissance Office, NRO. What does space travel have to do with psychological warfare? Spy satellites. Since 1960, the NRO, whose existence was only declassified in 1992, was launched dozens of secret spy satellites into space, collecting an incredible amount of information on the United States' friends, enemies, and citizens. As it is nearly impossible to obtain information regarding these highly classified endeavors, mission patches offer a rare glimpse into the world of PSYOPs. Even if one is not well versed in symbolism, it is easy to perceive a sinister vibe emanating from the patch designs. Laced with strange symbols, ominous creatures, obscure Latin phrases, and even dark humor, these patches reflect the mind state of those wearing the patches. The trailblazer in this area of research is Trevor Paglin, who in 2008 published the book I Could Tell You, But Then You Would Have to Be Destroyed by Me, Emblems from the Pentagon's Black World. By the means of hundreds of Freedom of Information requests, he obtained and analyzed 40 mission patches from the book reviews. Quote, the iconography of the United States military, not the mainstream military, with its bars of ribbons and medals, but the secret or black projects world, which may or may not involve contacting aliens, building undetectable spy aircraft, and experimenting with explosives that could make atomic bombs look like firecrackers. Here, mysteries, characters, and cryptic symbols hint at intrigue much deeper than rank, company, and unit, end quote, UTNE reader. Of course, quote, of course, issuing patches for a covert operation sounds like a joke. But truth be told, these days everything is branded. Military symbols and frequently replete with heraldic imagery, some rooted in history, others based on contemporary popular arts that feature comic characters. But these enigmatic dark op images, in some cases probably designed by the participants themselves, are more personal and also more disturbing than most. End quote. Stephen Heller, the New York Times Book Review. Since the release of this book, new mission patches have been released that are as strange and cryptic as their predecessors. If these patches are meant to symbolize the values of the crew and the objectives of the mission, perhaps we should be a little concerned. Here are the top 10 mission patches. Now, you can go to these patches. I'm not going to go through this whole article. It's very interesting, though. I mean, some of these have alien faces on it. Some of these have demons on it, dragons on it. I'm just going through them right now. There's like other alien beings on it. Let me see what else we got here. We got Pan, the ancient god of Pan, which is a nature deity, is on them. We have the pyramid with the separated capstone with the eye of the Illuminati, the eye of Horus, sun god from Egypt in there, relating to the Watchers. That's on a few different patches. It's the NROL patch. We have, we have a one-eyed being looking over the earth in another patch. It's Semper Vigilans. And let me see, we have an earth that's encapsulated, looks like in an iron grid, kind of in a prison grid. We've got some three-headed snakes here that are surrounding the earth. We have another patch that has nothing in it. It's just all black. I'm assuming black ops and secrets. We have get your kicks on Route 66, but holding the Route 66 sign is the ancient god of Moloch from ancient Babylon. Let me see here. We have another demon here with the American flag with flames. We got missiles, which is, almost normal, unfortunately. We have a dark angel, and let me see. We have some wizards on some of these, too, different wizards, and, having lightning bolts come out of them. I know this sounds all strange, but these are all real patches being by the U.S. military. The point is there's a lot of esoteric meaning behind the symbols and patches in the United States military. Like I said earlier in the show, some of those patches are old, ancient esoteric symbols that were used during human sacrifices, and that's what many of the soldiers are being used for human sacrifices, while being used as slaves and tools to push foreign policy, currently for the Zionist Rothschild agenda that's going on right now. There is no war whatsoever right now that's keeping the United States safe, keeping the UK safe, nothing like that. There are a lot of troops that are guarding the poppy fields in Afghanistan, with the CIA pumping that back to the States for heroin production, just like they did with Vietnam and the Iran-Contra scandal with the cocaine. But think about it, ladies and gentlemen. If you do the slightest bit of research, you will see that there is no military operation right now that has anything to do with anything about safety and security. It has to do with corporate takeover. It has to do with land grabs for Zionist agenda regarding a greater Israel. It has to do with globalism, Rothschild agenda, which all relates to Zionism and Israel. Israel dictates U.S. and U.K. foreign policy while painting negative pictures and spreading Islamophobia. And really, these soldiers are just poor working-class men and women going over to fight and kill and murder poor working-class men and women. I have some horrific audio. I'm not going to play it online, but of men, U.S. soldiers, admitting to gang raping children and preteens in Iraq. These horrors are just happening all. That doesn't mean all the U.S. soldiers are like this. There's a lot of great U.S. soldiers out there. All I'm saying is there's a lot going on that's not being exposed, and it's time we wake up. It's time we stop using and falling for the tool that is going to bring us into complete destruction. These wars aren't being used to save us. They're actually being used to help destroy us. Just like the economic collapse that's been orchestrated by the Rothschild family will be used as an excuse to implement a global economic system beyond their World Bank, which they own as well with the IMF. But, this global government using a global military of NATO as the predecessor, the UN as the predecessor to the global government, with the United States being the militaristic arm of this global military. There's a lot going on right now that we really need to wake up to, and they use patriotism to brainwash many. I live in America, so I'm going to say Americans, but it's all over, to brainwash many people into supporting these illegal wars because they're only watching that resident hypnotist in their living room, listening to every single word they say. Remember, most of those mainstream corporate news organizations are dictated by two news organizations, which in turn are dictated by the Rothschilds through their Zionist placement. And they're also all involved in defense contracts, so they're not going to say anything against our military horrors. We're attacking Syria. We're using drones. Let's look at that. Let me skip all the new nations we're attacking, including Somalia. But we're also using drones. We're using drones, people sitting in a chair at a computer murdering civilians, murdering women and children, using basically a video game to murder people. And people are like, oh, America, fuck yeah. And they get so idiotic with patriotism. But yet you ask them simple questions about these wars, and they cannot answer. They cannot answer. It's to fight Al-Qaeda. Remember, we created Al-Qaeda. It's a database back when we created the Mujahideen to help Afghanistan fight the Russians, or to get the Russians out of there. But we also fund the Taliban. It's all smoke and mirrors, ladies and gentlemen. And also keep in mind the House of Saud is the House of Rothschild regarding all this. I'm going to leave you guys with a brilliant, brilliant speech by a U.S. war veteran. He's an Iraq war veteran. I believe this came from Winter Soldier. There's a lot of truly brave soldiers. The truly brave soldiers are the ones that wake up to what's actually going on, expose it to the world, and refuse to fight and pay the consequences for refusing to fight. Just like in Israel, a lot of men and a lot of soldiers, or a lot of people, let me put it that way, are refusing to fight these Zionist wars because they know they're wrong and illegal, and it's for genocide and globalism, and they're being jailed for it. But you know what? I would rather live on my feet than die on my knees. Or did I say that completely wrong? I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. Sorry about that. Old quote. But let me go into this speech, the brilliant speech. Guys, we need to all pay attention and spread what's really going on. Because if people really knew what was going on beyond the illusions, no one would support these wars. Ladies and gentlemen, I love you. Take care of yourselves. And here's that speech by the amazing war veteran.
And I tried hard to be proud of my service, but all I could feel was shame. And racism could no longer mask the reality of the occupation. These were people. These were human beings. I've since been plagued by guilt anytime I see an elderly man, like the one who couldn't walk, who we rolled onto a stretcher and told the Iraqi police to take him away. I feel guilt anytime I see a mother with her children, like the one who cried hysterically and screamed that we are worse than Saddam as we forced her from her home. I feel guilt anytime I see a young girl, like the one I grabbed by the arm and dragged into the street. We were told we were fighting terrorists. The real terrorist was me, and the real terrorism is this occupation. Racism within the military has long been an important tool to justify the destruction and occupation of another country. It has long been used to justify the killing, subjugation, and torture of another people. Racism is a vital weapon employed by this government. It is a more important weapon than a rifle, a tank, a bomber, or a battleship. It is more destructive than an artillery shell, or a bunker buster, or a Tomahawk missile. While all those weapons are created and owned by this government, they are harmless without people willing to use them. Those who send us to war do not have to pull a trigger or lob a mortar round. They do not have to fight the war, they merely have to sell the war. They need a public who is willing to send their soldiers into harm's way. They need soldiers who are willing to kill and be killed without question. They can spend millions on a single bomb, but that bomb only becomes a weapon when the ranks of the military are willing to follow orders to use it. They can send every last soldier anywhere on earth, but there will only be a war if soldiers are willing to fight. And the ruling class, the billionaires who profit from human suffering, care only about expanding their wealth, controlling the world economy. Understand that their power lies only in their ability to convince us that war, oppression, and exploitation is in our interest. They understand that their wealth is dependent on their ability to convince the working class to die to control the market of another country. And convincing us to kill and die is based on their ability to make us think that we are somehow superior. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen have nothing to gain from this occupation. The vast majority of people living in the U.S. have nothing to gain from this occupation. In fact, not only do we have nothing to gain, but we suffer more because of it. We lose limbs, endure trauma, and give our lives. Our families have to watch flag-draped coffins lowered into the earth. Millions in this country without health care, jobs, or access to education must watch this government squander over $450 million a day on this occupation. Poor and working people in this country are sent to kill poor and working people in another country to make the rich richer. And without racism, soldiers would realize that they have more in common with the Iraqi people than they do with the billionaires who send us to war. I threw families onto the street in Iraq, only to come home and find families thrown onto the street in this country, in this tragic and unnecessary foreclosure crisis. We need to wake up and realize that our real enemies are not in some distant land. They're not people whose names we don't know and cultures we don't understand. The enemy is people we know very well and people we can identify. The enemy is a system that wages war when it's profitable. The enemy is the CEOs who lay us off from our jobs when it's profitable. It's the insurance companies who deny us health care when it's profitable. It's the banks who take away our homes when it's profitable. Our enemy is not 5,000 miles away. They are right here at home. If we organize and fight with our sisters and brothers, we can stop this war, we can stop this government, and we can create a better world.
If a fighting force came and invaded our nation and they started stealing land and murdering and raping and we fought back, would they call us terrorists, and would their manipulated media tell their conditioned people that we're terrorists to support this? Think about it, ladies and gentlemen.